Witchwater by Phyllis Reynolds Naylor, Chapter 4. She wore no apron, and there was no fragrance of cinnamon buns about her. Wisps of gray hair that had worked themselves loose from the bun at the back hung down about her wrinkled cheeks, and her eyes seemed to glower in the deep recesses of their sockets. The grin had disappeared now, and she was unsmiling. Lynn suspected that the old woman already knew why she had come. The cat, huge and brownish, rubbed against a porch pillar and watched Lynn with yellow slits of eyes. "I'd like to talk with you," Lynn said, and was sorry that her voice trembled slightly. She wanted to appear strong and confident. "Aye, and it's so fast you've been walking, I couldn't catch up," Mrs. Tuggle said, observing her closely. "I saw you leave your house while I was still at the bottom of the hill, and the higher you walked, the faster you went." She moved over to the door and thrust her key in the lock. "Come in, my dear." "I went to the butcher for some meat for the cat. I'll put it on a plate for him and fix our tea." "I don't want any tea, Mrs. Tuggle," Lynn said, determinedly stepping inside. "I'd just like to talk to you for a few minutes, if you don't mind." Mrs. Tuggle glanced at her out of the corner of her grey eye, but continued on into the kitchen. "Sit you down, Lynn, girl. I'll be there directly." Lynn went straight to the table in the corner. She wanted to look at the photograph of Mrs. Tuggle's brother one more time. She'd even brought a magnifying glass in the pocket of her jeans so that she could study the spider mark on the boy's medallion and check it once more with the cat's. She reached the table and stopped. The photograph was gone. Slowly she turned and sat down on an old velveteen chair, her heart thumping hard again, pulsating down through the palms of her hands. She could hear Mrs. Tuggle moving about the kitchen, talking to the cat, and pretty soon the tea kettle began to whistle. Lynn began to feel angry. The old woman hadn't paid any attention to what she had said at all. Finally, there was the clatter of china cups on a tray, footsteps in the hallway, and Mrs. Tuggle entered the parlor. She put the tray on the small end table, poured 2 cups, and sat down. "I don't want any tea," Lynn said again. "'Tis a special brew," Mrs. Tuggle said without looking at her. "Branch water. I drew it myself from the creek. 'Tis clear and clean and boils up into a tasty pot." "I don't want any," Lynn said for the 3rd time. Mrs. Tuggle said nothing. She sat with her cup sheltered in her bony hand, the steam rising up to her face, her nostrils flaring as they sucked in the fragrant mist. "This is it," Lynn thought to herself. She had to say it now. Somehow her lips had to form those ugly words, and she had to speak aloud what she had been thinking all these months. This was the end of the pretending, the masquerade. "Mrs. Tuggle," she said, with her fingers trembling in her lap, "I came to tell you that I know exactly what you're up to, and that you had better stop it." The old lady did not look startled or shocked. She did not even blink, Lynn recalled later. The one green eye and the one gray eye fixed themselves on Lynn, and she went on drinking from her cup. The cat came out of the kitchen, stood in the doorway and watched. "What on earth are you talking about, child?" Mrs. Tuggle said at last, sounding grandmotherly again. "You make no sense at all." Lynn began talking rapidly so she would not lose her resolve. "I think I am making very good sense, Mrs. Tuggle. I know that you are into witchcraft and that you have been working it on Marjorie Beasley. I think you should know that I won't let you hurt her." The cat leaped up on the bureau, its tail lashing back and forth. "Where did you get an idea like that?" Mrs. Tuggle exclaimed indignantly. "And why should I hurt little Marjorie? Does your mother know you're up here, Lynn, talking to me this way?" "No, but if I need to tell her, I will," Lynn said defiantly. She was glad that the tremor had left her voice now. She felt excited inside, as though she were bursting almost, and the words came tumbling out. "I'll tell her everything if I have to. I want you to stop those crows from following Marjorie around. Just leave us alone, especially her." There was no smile from Mrs. Tuggle's face now. She put down the teacup and frowned. "You are talking nonsense, Lynn," she snapped. "'Tis though the boggles have come and taken your mind, it is. What have the crows to do with an old lady like me?" "Only you can answer that," Lynn said, and she was conscious of the cat's tail thumping angrily against the side of the bureau. "But Mouse and I saw you talking to the crows down by the creek. We know what you're trying to do. You tried to turn Judith into a witch last summer and it didn't work, and now you're after Marjorie. If you don't stop it, I'm going to tell Mr. Beasley and my parents and everyone in town, and they'll believe me too, because they're already talking about you down at the courthouse." She stopped to catch her breath, realizing that she was talking far more confidently than she actually felt. She had never seen the old woman's face look so terrible. If there had been softness in her eyes, or pink on her cheeks, or gentleness to her brow, there was none now. "And what are the people saying about me, eh?" she asked sharply. Lynn wondered if she should have brought that up, but it was too late now. "They're talking because there's no death certificate on file for your brother, and some are saying that maybe his death wasn't accidental at all." She stopped, not allowing herself to say more. Let Mrs. Tuggle worry about it. "That would be even better." So you accuse me then, do you?" Mrs. Tuggle said coldly. "I accuse you of being a witch," Lynn said, staring right back. At that moment, the cat gave such a shriek that Lynn jumped with fright. She wheeled around just as the animal leaped to the top of the mantel, then to the curtains, down to the sofa, and went streaking out of the room and up the stairs, screaming again its almost human cry. "And see what you've done now, upset my cat," Mrs. Tuggle scolded, frowning angrily. "Ashamed your mother would be of you, Lynn Morley." Lynn got up and walked out into the hall. "All I'm asking of you, Mrs. Tuggle, is that you leave us alone. It's hopeless anyway, because Mouse knows all about you too, and she's got a book that tells about spells and things." At that, Mrs. Tuggle began to smile. The smile grew wider and wider, stretching her lips till the gums showed gray and the gold tooth gleamed. "I am a lot older than you, Lynn girl, and much, much wiser," she said. "Take care that you don't turn the spirits against you." She laughed then, as if to herself, but after the door closed, Lynn could still hear the laughing, and it made the flesh on her arms rise up in small bumps. She was halfway home before she even realized that her legs were moving. She slowed down and tried to catch her breath, so she would not attract attention when she walked in. It was done. She had said it, and felt both exhilarated and frightened. Things would never be the same between them again, she knew. If Mrs. Tuggle ever had any fondness for Lynn, she had none now, but the old woman wouldn't tell her mother. Of that Lynn was sure, and she was positive now that her suspicions had been correct all along. Mrs. Tuggle would have to leave them alone too. She hadn't liked what Lynn had told her about the town gossip. She would have to be more careful of what she did, and could not afford to have two young girls telling their parents about her. For a brief moment, Lynn felt a new wave of uncertainty rush through her, because she had already told her parents what she suspected, and they had not believed her, but Mrs. Tuggle need not know that. She and Mouse were safe from her, she felt sure. They could concentrate on other things like school and skateboards, and whether or not they would go to camp together next summer. "Lynn," Mrs. Morley called, "I wondered where you went." "Just out for a walk." Lynn tried to sound casual. "Bread done yet?" "No, it has to rise again. We'll have some for dinner." Lynn wished she could tell Mouse right away about the visit to Mrs. Tuggle, but knew she would not be home from the bookstore till evening. She went upstairs and lay on her bed, feeling suddenly exhausted from the confrontation. Maybe witchcraft works psychologically, she was thinking. If she were suggestible, she could suspect that Mrs. Tuggle had put a hex on her somehow, that her tiredness was actually the curse of death, and she would grow weaker and weaker until she died. If she really believed it, she would be so paralyzed with fear that she would not eat, and if she stopped eating, she would get weaker yet, and finally she would really die. Well, she wouldn't let that happen to her. At dinner time, to assure herself that she was okay, she ate twice the usual amount, plenty of fried chicken, bread, even green beans. "What'd you do this afternoon, jog a couple of miles?" Mr. Morley asked as he watched the food on her plate disappear. "Must be the fall weather," Mother said. "If she keeps on eating that way, she'll be gross when she gets to junior high," Judith commented. Lynn was halfway through dessert when the phone rang, and she answered it in the hall. "Oh, Lynn," came Marjorie's voice. "The most awful thing happened. When I left the house this morning, I must have forgotten to close the back door tight. The wind blew it open and some animal got in. I left that book on the kitchen table because I was reading it at breakfast, and it's all clawed to pieces. It's in shreds." Lynn stood frozen to the floor. She could hardly speak. "The book on spells and potions?" "Yes, there's nothing left of it, and Daddy's furious. He says if I hadn't left it on the table, it couldn't have happened. And now I'm not even to touch any of his rare books, ever. He says if it hadn't been for you, I wouldn't have been reading it in the first place. There are only a few copies of books in the whole world, and he's so mad, Lynn." "Oh, no, no," Lynn breathed. She felt sick. Things were getting worse, not better. "Oh, Mouse, I feel so awful." "Well, I suppose he'll get over it in a couple of days. but he'll never feel better about the book. But Lynn, it's so scary. The animal didn't bother anything else. We know it was an animal because there were dark brown hairs on the table, like fur, Lynn. Do you suppose it was? Yes, I'm sure of it, said Lynn. It did not take long for Lynn to realize that her visit to Mrs. Tuggles had not made things better, but had instead made them immeasurably worse. First, the crows continued to follow Mouse. Mrs. Tuggle had not been scared off at all by Lynn's threats. Second, Lynn's babbling about the rare book on spells and potions had been a serious mistake. Now that the book was destroyed, Lynn and Mouse had lost the information they might need to protect themselves further. And to make it all worse, Mr. Beasley was angry at Lynn. Third, it had put the old woman on guard, now that she knew what Mouse and Lynn thought about her, and what the townsfolk were whispering, she would be craftier still. And finally, Lynn felt that in accusing Mrs. Tuggle, she was committed to fighting the witchcraft alone. Her parents would certainly not have approved if they knew. If her father thought at all that the old lady was dangerous, he would have done something himself. He would not have let Lynn go up to the house on the hill and make wild accusations. Instead, he would have tried to discover the truth. But what else could she have done? She longed to confide in someone. There was no school on Monday because of a state teachers' meeting. Mother went to her studio as usual, however, and left Judith and Lynn in charge of Stevie. Lynn's little brother stood on the stairs flying a paper airplane over the banister to the floor below. When he tired of that, he sprawled out on the landing, staring up at the dust particles that streamed silently around in the light from the small window above. I wish I had a pet, he bellowed loudly after a bit. Bobby Lawson has a pet. Darren Mills has a pet. Tony Corona has a pet. Gil Klaus has a pet. Alice Davis has a pet. What kind would you want? Lynn asked from downstairs in order to stop the recitation. Something I can play with, something I can put in my bicycle basket and ride around. Judith came down from upstairs, stepping over Stevie on the landing, and went into the kitchen for an orange. The problem with pets, Stevie, she called, sitting on the bottom step to peel it, is that you have to take care of them. It would be fun for a while, but you'd get tired of all the work. I wouldn't get tired of it, Stevie insisted. Everybody in this family has somebody littler than him except me. Judith smiled. You want to walk down to the pet store just to see the puppies? We can't buy one, but I know Mr. Brickstone would let you hold one. Stevie jumped up. Sure. Want to come, Lynn? It's gorgeous out. I guess not, Lynn said. She had other things on her mind. As soon as Judith and Stevie left, she set off up the hill to Mother's studio. It was, Lynn had to admit, a cozy studio. An old brick walk covered with moss led around to Mrs. Tuggle's backyard, where it branched off in two directions, one path leading to the old barn and the other to the hen house. In a few minutes, Lynn was standing outside the white building with the low roof, the windows clustered at each end. A little stovepipe chimney stuck out the top, and a thin wisp of smoke trailed from it, indicating that the wood-burning stove inside was in operation. If only Mrs. Tuggle wasn't there talking. Lynn gave a little knock on the rusty orange-painted door and went inside. Mrs. Morley was sitting in a rocking chair beside the stove, her feet propped up on an opened drawer of her desk. The entire back wall, completely covered with built-in boxes where hens had once nested, now held writing supplies, large envelopes in one, small envelopes in another, manila envelopes, carbon sets, bond paper, reference books, published books, old manuscripts, file folders. Each of them had a special place. The frames round each window were orange, like the door, and there was a small braided rug of orange, white, and yellow on the cement floor. And there on the rug lay Mrs. Tuggle's cat, its head upright, watching as Lynn came in. Well, Mrs. Morley said, looking up, it's not often I have a visitor way back here. Come on in, honey. Judith took Stevie down to the pet store, and I thought maybe I could do some office work for you, filing or something. Lynn sat on the corner of her mother's desk. The cat followed her with his eyes. What a nice thought. Let me think. I've got just the job for you. Mother got up, put her clipboard and pen on the rocker, and walked over to the low file cabinets beneath the windows at one end. She was wearing a pair of plaid socks and a yellow sweater, and if Lynn hadn't known better, she would have thought that Mother had worked here in the chicken coop all her life. It was just right for her, warm and cozy, small and bright. The problem was that sometimes Mrs. Tuggle dropped in or invited Mother up the house. Come here, I'll show you what needs to be done, Mrs. Morley said. She pulled open a drawer marked resource material. It was crammed full of file folders, and each one was labeled anthropology, art, creativity, death, dreams, ESP, fears, future, gypsies, hermits, humor. Each folder was bursting with pages torn from magazines and newspapers. This is the file where I keep articles that might be useful to me in writing a certain story or book, Mother explained. I'd like you to look over each article in each folder, trim the edges, and cut off whatever part of the newspaper I don't need, then put the clipping back neatly in the folder. I'm running out of room because the folders are too thick. Here's the scissors and the wastebasket. You can stop whenever you get tired. Lynn sat down on the braided rug, cross-legged, and spread the first folder out on the floor. Mother, she said, remembering why she had really come, if I did something you didn't like, but I'd done it to save a friend, would you still be angry? Mrs. Morley put down her writing board again. Now, what kind of a question is that? You mean if you ruined a good set of clothes by jumping in a creek to rescue somebody? Of course I wouldn't be angry. She studied her daughter for a moment. But I don't think that's what you had in mind. Well, not really, Lynn said. I mean, if I said something that upset somebody. We all say things we wish we hadn't, Mother said. That doesn't concern me too much. Why? Who are you planning to upset? Lynn shook her head. Nobody, she murmured. Mrs. Morley laughed. Lynn, I can read you like a book. You're suspecting poor Mrs. Tuggle again. You know your suspicions are going to drive the old dear to doing something really witchy sometime, and then you'll be sorry. Sometimes people turn out to be what others accuse them of being, simply because it seems easier than forever defending themselves. Lynn stared at the clippings there on the floor without really seeing them. Could it work the other way too? She wondered. Could a girl like Mouse be made to feel so weak and vulnerable that finally she believed she was helpless and just gave in? The problem with having visitors here is that I don't get much work done, Mother said. Let's see if we can have 15 minutes of silence while I finish this one paragraph. Lynn busied herself with the folders. She carefully cut the clippings out of the rest of the newspaper pages, stapled continued stories together, and put them back. Mother, she said, does... She stopped, realizing that she was interrupting again. Mrs. Morley looked up expectantly. Well, know that you've got my attention. What's the question? I won't bother you any more, Lynn promised. I just wanted to know if Mrs. Tuggle's cat comes here every day. Yes, he's usually waiting for me when I arrive in the morning, or else comes by later and scratches at the door. I think Mrs. Tuggle lets him out at night so he can prowl around. He seems to enjoy stretching out here on the rug by the stove. But you know that cat never really seems to relax or sleep. In fact, I've never seen him close his eyes. He's always watching. For the next few days, Lynn stayed away from the Beasley house. If anything else happened, if the cat got in again, she did not want to be blamed for it. Mr. Beasley laid the mischief on Lynn, Mouse, and Squirrels in that order. In school on Friday, Lynn sat at the back of the room, toying with a paperclip. She had completed her math test and was waiting for the others to finish. She would have 5 minutes of uninterrupted thought, and she was glad. Her mind was always sharpest after a math test. Her family, as she saw it, was divided 3 ways. Mother relied mostly on feelings, on sensing things, knowing them through intuition. Living to her was an act, or was an art. When she did something, she did it rather spontaneously because it just seemed like a good thing to do. And Stevie and Judith were very much like her. Father, however, was just the opposite. To him, life was a science. He planned things in advance. He did or said something because he had thought it out and knew the consequences. Inside his head, Lynn was sure, was a computer with plastic buttons and knobs and wheels, and everything he did was programmed down to whether he could eat a bite of steak next or a biscuit. Father could tell you exactly why he thought or believed anything at all. Everything he did was subjected to scientific inquiry, and if it didn't come out high on that score, he would have nothing more to do with it. Lynn was somewhere in between. She believed strongly in hunches and feelings and suppositions. But she also believed in stopping along the way to examine them, test them out to see if she made sense. If they didn't, it did not mean that they wouldn't. It just meant that she had to keep trying until evidence proved that her hunch had been right. The topic to think about this morning was crows. Lynn had once thought that even if the crows followed Mouse about for the rest of her natural life, they wouldn't hurt her. After all, what could they do? Pick her up and carry her off? Hardly. Attack her? Possibly, but not likely. And what good would that do? Should either of these things happen, Mrs. Tuggle's witchcraft would have crossed over the line of coincidence and would be exposed for everyone to see. Now Lynn believed that the crows had a more practical purpose than that. They were being used, she was sure, to frighten Marjorie, to convince her that she was the chosen one and that it was futile to escape. It was brainwashing, a wearing down of the will, so that Mouse would decide that joining Mrs. Tuggle's coven was far better than always being terrified. Lynn leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands. Maybe the old woman hadn't been as alone, as inactive in all these years as people had thought. Maybe she had made witches and warlocks out of some of the other girls and boys in town, and no one really knew about it. Maybe her emissions of black magic were spreading all over the state of Indiana, and in going after Mouse, she was just doing what she'd been doing year after year. She hadn't been successful with Judith, but maybe that was just the way it was. Win some and lose some, all in a month's work. "Time!" called the teacher. "Put your pencils down and pass your papers to the front of the room, please." Lynn straightened up, handed her paper over the shoulder of the boy in front of her, and glanced across the room at Mouse. Marjorie was still on page 2. She hadn't even started the third. That wasn't like her at all. A crow cawed from somewhere outside, and Marjorie's pencil dropped out of her hand and onto the floor. She was staring out the window and didn't even notice. "I won't let Mrs. Tuggle take Mouse," Lynn told herself determinedly. When Lynn reached home at 3:30, Mother was in the music room going over some pieces on the piano. "House cleaning," she said, trying to speak in time to the note she was playing. "I found all this old music in the piano bench, and I'm deciding what to keep." Lynn put her books down on the window seat and went to the kitchen for a handful of ginger snaps. The music stopped. "I was always sorry I couldn't get you girls interested in music lessons," came Mother's voice from the next room. "I always wanted to be a great singer, and of course I'm not, but it is rather odd that neither you nor Judith wants to learn to play the piano." Huh, thought Lynn. She'd always wanted to be a bareback rider in the circus herself, but that was definitely out. She didn't have a horse, so she decided to be a psychiatrist instead and find out why she always wanted to be a bareback rider and why Mom always wanted to sing and why Mouse seemed so helpless about resisting Mrs. Tuggle. "Did you see Stevie on the playground?" Mother asked when Lynn sauntered back through the hallway eating cookies. "Didn't look." "Well, he's probably playing there, I guess. He left about an hour ago. He didn't say where he was going." She stood up and piled some music on the stand by the piano. "Next time Marjorie comes over, have her take a look at these and see if she wants any of them." Lynn took her books up to her room and lay down on her bed to study for a while. At 4:30, her mother came up, and Lynn could tell by her face that something was wrong. "Lynn, I'm worried about Stevie. He's still not home. Would you run over to the school and see if he's playing there?" Lynn slipped her feet back into her loafers, clattered down 2 flights of stairs to the landing, then down to the first floor and out the door. It wasn't like Stevie to go away like this. Usually he told them if he was even crossing the street. As he got older, though, he was getting more independent. Already, when he left kindergarten at noon, he often came straight home by himself instead of waiting for Mother on the corner. They had to expect things like this now and then. Lynn rounded the corner and broke into a run, jogging the rest of the way. At the schoolyard, 2 children were climbing the jungle gym. "Have you seen Stevie?" she asked. They shook their heads. Going back, Lynn cut through the yards of the houses along the way until she arrived breathlessly at her own steps. A terrible feeling of dread was creeping up on her. "He wasn't there, Mother," she said. Mrs. Morley turned to Judith. "I'm going to search along the creek and see if he's playing down there. Lynn, try all the neighbors. And Judith, why don't you go to the pet shop? He just might have wandered down there since he enjoyed it so the other day." Lynn went inside and phoned Mouse, because she was the only one of the 2 with a bike. "Ask everyone you see, Mouse," she begged. Then she started out herself, knocking on doors and stopping at houses where Stevie sometimes played. No one had seen him since he'd walked home with Mrs. Morley for lunch. Mother said he'd gone out to play in the side yard and then disappeared. When half an hour had gone by with still no sign of Stevie, Lynn knew what she must do, and terror gripped her. Was it possible that her visit had so enraged the old woman that she had done something to Stevie? Look what the cat had done to Mr. Beasley's rare book. Maybe Mrs. Tuggle was far more powerful than Lynn had imagined. Maybe she had lured Stevie up to her house to hold him as hostage in exchange for the allegiance of Lynn and Mouse. Lynn tried not to think about what she must do, but she knew she had to go straight up to Mrs. Tuggles. She had to go to the door and say that she had come for Stevie. No, she would say that her mother had sent for Stevie. In fact, her father had sent her. And she would say in a direct, no-nonsense kind of tone, as though they had known all along that Stevie was there and they wanted him back immediately. She reached the top of the hill, past the clump of spruce trees, and then stopped. Marjorie's bike was leaning against Mrs. Tuggles' fence, and the gate was wide open. And that is the end of chapter 4.